Hello and welcome to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Danny and I'm an illustrator specialising in natural history. A few months ago I made this video where I had a go at recreating my usual watercolour style using digital watercolours in the Procreate app. And I was fairly happy with the results. I was able to combine the digital animals with the traditionally painted ones to make this print. But let's be honest, that was a bit of a cop-out because those were sharks. Very smooth, pretty much one solid colour throughout, not much detail going on, and it was a bit of an easy starting point for that experiment. What I really want to see is how well I can replicate this watercolour style when it comes to painting something a little more complicated. But before I can start drawing, there's one thing I need to do. If you learn anything from my channel, it's that peanut butter smoothies make you a better artist. I thought I would go with ducks for this drawing because the different species have such beautiful different colours and different complexities within their markings. Now, Procreate is obviously great for sketching because you can just keep adding new layers and refining the sketch, resizing and repositioning elements until you get it right. But for some reason, when it comes to drawing animals, I still just really enjoy sketching them out traditionally. And so in this little tiny Royal Talons sketchbook, I've got some pages of ducks that I've already drawn. I love doing these kind of sketches with coloured pencils rather than graphite because it can't be so easily erased, and so it keeps the drawings sort of slightly looser and, I don't know, maybe a little bit more quirky looking. It stops me getting too caught up in the detail. So all I'm going to do is use the iPad to snap a photograph of that shell duck and bring it into my Procreate document. So I'm going to resize it to fill the page, and looking at this drawing, I think that maybe his head is a bit too big, so I'm just going to select that, cut and paste it to a new layer, and then I can just adjust it. Maybe that's enough actually, just the slightest adjustment to make it a bit more balanced. Merge those two layers and reduce the opacity. And now on a new layer, I can start the drawing. Now, when I do the traditional watercolour drawings, the outlines are done with one of these pigment liners. This is a 0.08. Normally I'd use 0.05, so 0.05, so very, very small. I haven't got one of those to show you, but it's that kind of pigment liner. And the best way to replicate that I've found in Procreate is to use... Sorry, my mind went blank. The best way to replicate that in Procreate is to use the dry ink pen, which is, it comes with the app, it's in the inking set. So dry ink. And I'm going to use this colour, which is not quite black. Okay, and I've set that pen to just 3% there on the size, so it's going to be very thin. And then we just start drawing in the outline. When I do this, I try not to do it in big single sweeping lines like this, because that's not the way I would draw if I were using the pen on watercolour paper. I try to use more broken, sort of scratchy lines like this, just because that more closely replicates what I would be doing with traditional media. I take a bit more care around the important features like his bill and his eye, which I will come back to, but with the rest of it, be a bit more loose. So this dry ink pen is pressure sensitive, so if you press lightly you get very fine lines, put a bit more pressure and you'll get a darker, heavier line. That's obviously not how the fine liner pens work in reality, so I'm just trying to sort of keep that line weight fairly consistent as I draw these lines in. And if there's anywhere where I want the lines to be a little darker or a little more obvious, then I will, instead of pressing harder and getting a darker line to begin with, I would just go over those lines. And that's because what I'm trying to do here is really emulate what I would be doing in reality with the pen. As I said, this isn't how I would necessarily draw in Procreate normally, but for the purposes of this drawing, that's what I'm doing. Birds' feet, and in particular webbed feet, are the hardest thing in the world to draw. Years and years of drawing birds and I still struggle with their legs and feet. So we're not going to look too closely at these. We're just going to acknowledge that he has got feet and leave it at that. So once I've got that outline roughly down, I can go ahead and delete that sketch layer. I need to stop looking at his feet, they're so bad. Okay, what I need to do before I add any colour to this is to make it look like watercolour paper, and there are several ways you can do that. You can get something called a magic canvas, which you sometimes get with the watercolour brush sets that you can buy, and that not only adds the watercolour paper texture, but it also adds a sort of effects to the colours that you put down, so it might vary the texture, put a bit of grain in there and stuff. But I'm going to use a much simpler method, and that is to just add a photo that I took, or a scan, of some watercolour paper. Now, if you don't have a scanner or watercolour paper, you could probably get this sort of thing on somewhere like Unsplash, which is a photo website where you can get royalty-free images. We're going to set that to the top above all the artwork layers that we're going to be working on and set it to multiply. So coming back underneath that watercolour paper texture, I'm going to add a new layer, and actually I need it to be underneath the line work. And I'm going to select a colour, doesn't really matter what colour, let's go with something, not yellow, purple. I don't know why I spent so long choosing a colour, it really didn't matter. Okay, and I'm going to use the Studio pen, which also comes in the inking set that comes with Procreate. Now this next step isn't essential, but I find it really useful with any pictures that I create in watercolour, and that is to just make a solid base layer underneath everything else that we're going to draw on this animal. So I'm just going around the inside of the pen lines, making sure not to leave any gaps and trying to stay within the lines. Okay, so once we've got the outline done, we just take that colour and drop it in to fill the shape. And it doesn't matter what colour I chose there because I'm actually going to change it to white. I just used the purple because it was easier to see as I was doing it against the white background. Now the reason I created this shape is because it gives me a solid background behind my painting. So with some of the layers that I'm going to use now with the watercolour brushes, they'll be translucent, which means if I were to put a background on this picture, any background colour might show through those translucent layers. Having this there will prevent that from happening. It's also really useful if I want to apply any clipping masks. I've got this as a sort of foundation to set those layers to, and you'll see that as I go on. So now it's time to start adding in some colour, and I need to look at a reference of a shell duck just to remind myself exactly what colours they are. So I go to the canvas menu up here and set reference, and it will allow me to pick a picture from my photos, and I've got one here of a shelduck that I just grabbed off Google, and I'm not copying this image, I'm just using it to remind myself what colours go where. I think I'm going to start with that beak. Now it's quite bright, but because we're using watercolours, or we're trying to look like we're using watercolours, I'm going to go a little bit more muted. And I think the brush that I will use is one that comes with the Julia Dreams watercolour brush set. It's quite a basic brush set, it's not got too many different brushes in it, which I think is brilliant, because you get brush sets with loads of different options, it's overwhelming and you don't know where to start, and some of them are really similar and, you know, unnecessary. I like that this just has very distinct, simple brushes. It's really sort of user-friendly. So it's called Julia Dreams First Brush, and it's just a basic watercolour brush. And you need to make sure you're using a new layer above that outline layer that we made. I've zoomed in really far here, there was no need for that. Now the thing with watercolour brushes is to try not to take the pencil off the screen as you're laying down the colour. If you do, you'll get areas like this where it builds up. And that's fine, you might want to go for that look, but most of the time I don't want to do that. I'm just going to go slightly darker colour just for underneath. Maybe even a touch darker still. But just as with real watercolours, I started with the lightest shade and built up. So at the moment that doesn't look great, but this is where the magic happens. We're going to use the Julia Dreams Water Wash Brush. Now if you try and use this as a brush, not a lot happens, and that's because it's designed to be used as a blender. So if I just follow those lines of where I added the other colours, and you can see it's blending them out, making it look more like real watercolour. And you can play around with this and get different effects. And I think I'm going to go back to that brush, just add even more darkness to these bits, and repeat that process of blending those in. Don't go overboard with the blending, because you will ruin it and lose the sort of watercolour texture that you created in the first place. Now you can see I've gone over the lines. That doesn't matter because I'm just going to use the Studio Pen brush as an eraser. Whoops, not that big. And rub those out. And to be honest, that's something that I have to do when I use real watercolours. I often go over the lines and have to tidy it up in Photoshop. Okay, next I'm going to go onto the head, which is a kind of, it looks black, but I think in reality though it's very dark green. Now I'm not entirely sure how to tackle this head because it's so dark it could end up not looking like watercolour, it could end up being too heavy. I do know I'm going to use a new layer, again on top of that white base layer, so that whatever I do doesn't interfere with the beak that I've already done. And I'm going to start with quite a light green compared to the colour of its head, because I can build up that colour. And I think what I'm going to do to get a watercolour texture is use a stamp brush. So let's have a look, what have we got? This is Lisa Glanz's Aqua Real watercolour set, and it includes a number of these stamp brushes which are scanned watercolour textures. This one's quite nice, it's got a lot of texture in it. And that's what it looks like when you stamp it down. That's a bit too big. Let's try that again. So I'm just looking to roughly cover the head, that's alright. Missed a bit of the head off there, but I'm gonna move this around into a position that I like, where it's sort of got these textures included in the area that I want to cover. Quite like that. Now obviously I need it to just be where the duck is, so I'm going to set that layer to a clipping mask, and because it's got this base layer underneath it, it will just clip to that shape. That looks quite good already actually. I might just play around and duplicate that layer, make it a bit darker. Play around with these mask settings, is that what they're called? The settings within the layer, to get different effects from it. So I quite like, where was it? Linear burn. It gives us quite a nice dark green, but it's a bit too much. So we can reduce that. And then we can also move that layer around so that the watercolour textures aren't sitting on top of each other, they're sort of building up, layering up, if that makes sense. That's quite nice, but it isn't dark enough. This is looking a bit more like black on this bird, so I think what I'm going to do is repeat that process but with a much darker colour. Maybe that's too dark. Oh no, let's go dark, we can always adjust it afterwards. And I'm going to use a different watercolour stamp this time just to vary that texture. One that's got a lot of texture in it. Let's have a look. That one. At the moment it's set to uniform. If you click freeform here, when you vary it, it won't keep the same aspect ratio, so you can squidge it in and things like that. And let's set it to clipping mask. And again, play around with the blend modes, that's what they're called, blending modes. Okay, that's quite good. What I don't like though is the way that this is coming down here, down his back, that's too far. And it's also given us quite a distinct line, or two distinct lines which look weird. So I'm going to use the eraser, and I'm going to select a watercolour brush, and again this is from Lisa Glanz's set. Let's go with this one, it's called Bloom Accents. I'm going to blend these three layers of watercolour stamp together because I'm happy with the way they look now, and now that they're blended together it means I can go in and erase all of them like this. And you can see that that gives quite a nice watercolory texture, as if it had been used wet on wet. And you can even use the eraser in this way to create little patches like that, where as if little droplets have been added to the water, which is something that I do when I'm using watercolours. I've switched the reference photo to one that more clearly shows the markings from that side view, and what I'm going to tackle now is this chestnut patch here. I'm not entirely sure how I'm going to do it because it has quite a clean edge to this side and then a sort of softer, more blurred edge here. And I think what I'm going to do is use the same technique that I did on the head, so use a stamp brush to create the area, but I'm specifically looking for one that has a nice clean edge to it, so maybe that one. Drop it in roughly the right place. It's already set to a clipping mask on that new layer, so it's only showing up on the duck. And then just adjust that shape and move it around until I get that edge to kind of line up with what I'm after on that side. I'm not worried about this lower side right now. Once that's in place, I'm going to use the eraser again, set to a watercolour texture, to just push in and create that soft edge here. And when you're doing this, it's good to just keep tweaking the brush size so that you don't get the same stroke repeated. It looks a little bit more random. That's not bad. And I quite like that little hole there. That's what would happen with real watercolour. You'd end up with little white patches. Now I'm going to use the Studio pen as an eraser just to take away this excess here. So there'd be a nice clean line here on, oops, on the wing. Actually, I'm going to use ink bleed. Ink bleed is similar to Studio Pen, but it's got a little bit more texture to the edge, you can see. So it maybe creates more of a natural edge to the watercolour. And again, back to the watercolour texture, just to erase this bit here. So when you apply colour in this way, it's better to fill a larger area than you need and then erase into it than to try and add more colour to fill the area if you didn't put enough down in the first place, if that makes sense. So that's looking quite good, but I do want to vary the colour a bit because this is very flat. It's all one shade of brown, and when I use watercolour in reality I would mix several different pigments together and drop them into the wet paint and let those colours sort of merge and bleed together, and I really love the effects that you get when you do that with watercolour. Make a selection first of all and feather that selection out. That's important because that's going to soften the edges of the selection that I made. And then I'm going to use the hue, saturation and brightness adjustments to just tweak that colour. And this time I'm just going to adjust the brightness and the saturation just to darken that slightly, and you can see the effect that that's had. Another way that we can change that colour and add a bit of variety to it is to create another layer above. It's naturally set to clipping mask. Select a lighter colour and use another one of these stamp brushes over the top of it. I like this one. I'm going to change that blend mode to multiply for now, but I might adjust that again. I liked the way that turned out with the darkness, so now I'm doing another one where I'm going to change the blend mode a different way to see if we can get a lighter effect. And you can also adjust the opacity slider, so if that effect is, if I zoom in you can see, if that effect is too strong, you can bring that down and make it more subtle. And again, you can reposition that mark, change the shape and the size of it until you get an effect that you're happy with. So again, just using the watercolour bloom brush as an eraser, whoops, and making sure I'm on the right layer, I'm going to erase that excess bit there. I've replicated that colouring process with this other chestnut area here and this sort of lighter brown area under his tail, and there's lots of ways that I could have added the colour, but actually once I started using those stamps in that way I found that I really liked the effect I got, so I just carried on. But when you look at this black area here, you can see that the stamp I used didn't quite meet the contour of the wing shape that I needed. So what I'm going to use is, if I go to adjustments and liquify, move this out of the way, I'm going to select this push tool here, and you can just use it to push the shape that you've made or the colour that you've laid down into position. So that's the bulk of the colour laid down. What I need to do is just add some to this white area. So I'm just going to select a very pale purple or pink, grey, something like that. And I'm going to use, let's see, let's go with Lisa Glanz's round brush, all-rounder. So this is just another watercolour brush, a sort of basic round watercolour brush, and I'm just going to add in some areas of shadow to the white, making sure I'm on a new layer. What I'm also trying to do is follow the natural contours of the bird. So I'm not going to go down or across like that. I'm going to follow that natural curvature of his big round body. If I were doing this in real watercolour, a lot of it would be done wet on wet so that it really sort of had soft edges and blended away into the white paper. What I'm going to do to try and recreate that is use the wash blender brush again. Let's use the Julia Dreams one to blend that out. Okay, and then let's play around with these blending modes and see what we can do. I think I'll just go with multiply. But just as before, I'm going to make some random selections. Feather them out. And what I'm going to do is use this Julia Dreams airbrush, which is a very soft sort of watercolour wash type brush, and with that selection still in place, I'm just going to lightly go over it. And it should add some hints of pink to some areas. Okay, and we'll just use the Studio pen to erase where it went over the edge of the bird. Now that's given me some really basic and quite soft areas of colour within the white. What I'm going to do now is use the same all-round brush from Lisa Glanz and just a little bit more carefully this time go in and add some areas of shadow. Now, when I work with real watercolours, some of that initial pen line that I put down would be lost because it would be underneath the paints, and even though the paint's translucent, it would just sort of dampen the effect of the pen. So what I would do after painting is to go back in with the fine liner pen and just touch up not all of the lines but some of the lines, just to pick out the details. And I think I'm going to do that with this one too, because certain bits do seem to have been lost. So going back to the dry ink brush, and I'm especially looking at the sort of important areas, those kind of focal points. I'm doing this on, no I'm not, I am now doing this on a new layer above the initial pen layer so that I can play around with the opacity and stuff if I need to, or erase any without erasing the original pen layer. The black lines are what help bring it all together. I'm quite a messy watercolour painter, and a lot of the sort of detail in my pictures comes from the line work, which I tend to think it kind of holds the painting together, holds that mess in place. It's also nice to give a sort of feathery or furry texture to the edge like this when you're drawing animals. And at this point, with a real painting, I would also finely add the eye using a pen. So as I said earlier, the pen lines, they're not just there to outline the animal, they also hint at the texture of the fur or the feathers and hint at the form as well. There's a couple of areas where I think I've gone too heavy with the pen, so I'm just going to use the eraser, also set to dry ink. And I'm not going to follow the line and erase it that way. I'm going to go across, like this. Whoops, not across the eye. And what that's doing is just breaking up that line a bit. Okay, one very important thing, using the white to add a little highlight to the eye to make the duck come alive. We can also put a little bit on the shiny beak as well. With real watercolours, there's one last thing that I do, and that is to take one of these. This is an oil-based pencil by Faber-Castell, and I just use it to emphasise the line work and also add more shading. It sort of adds a 3D-ness to the picture, if that makes sense. So I'm going to try and do that with the digital pencils. So these marks, they don't go everywhere where I put pen lines, just anywhere where I think I need to suggest more shadow, like more light and dark, or more of a sense of shape. He's basically finished. If this was a real watercolour image, what I'd do next would be to scan him in and then remove this watercolour background texture, because if I'm going to print him, I need that to not be there. It has to be a sort of plain white background. And I can do that really easily here by going to that original base layer that we made, the duck shape, selecting those pixels and coming back up to the watercolour paper and copy and paste that. So if I hide the watercolour page, you can see we've made a duck shape out of the watercolour paper texture, and if we set that to multiply, it will only be applied to the duck and not the image as a whole. I'll be honest, while I was working on this duck, I didn't like him. I thought he looked too digital, just not enough like real watercolour, but now he's finished, I like him more. I don't love him, but I like him more, and there is some nice texture and stuff going on there. It's just not quite as it would be with a real watercolour. I made another duck as well. He's got some different textures going on, but again, he's still quite digital looking. It's a work in progress. So am I going to carry on and make the rest of these ducks in Procreate? I don't know. I'm looking at these drawings and I'm just thinking about how beautiful ducks are and all the lovely colours and textures and patterns that they have, and it's making me really want to paint them. That's my problem, isn't it? I can't focus on one thing for longer than 5 minutes.